All right, so if you hear me lecture about like Black Lives Matter and like systemic criminal justice change or reform, one of the things that bothers me is like when you see even what Angela Davis did with like bail, California penal code revisions and changes and bail criminal justice reform to like keep people out of one of the worst jails in the country where the Aryan Brotherhood started in San Quentin is a lack of like systemic change. So when you look at like what happened with three different police chiefs in Burlington, Vermont, or even with George Floyd, of kind of like public outcry and people getting angry and protests and things kind of like devolving or escalating kind of into like civic unrest that turns into basically rioting and things like that is just a lack of systemic change. Like in Burlington, we had like a few minor concessions. I think a couple people lost their jobs. We went through three different chiefs before. Kind of, I mean, I call him my friend. Deputy Chief Merritt is our inside joke. And I talked to him. I used to talk to him regularly. I haven't seen him in a while. Became kind of an interim chief and kind of looking to fill the position when Brandon Del Pozo, who did it for many years and worked closely with people like me and State's Attorney George and other people to help more progressive policing policies and a harm reduction effort towards substance use treatment, which was kind of leading the way in criminal justice reform in Burlington, Vermont in 2019, I think, 2018, 2019. What happened was he was a New York City cop that just dealt with stress well, as much of an a-hole as he might have been. And he was meant for that position. Deputy Chief Merritt is the joke with me because he's a great, easygoing guy, but he's much more of a deputy chief than a chief. And it's pretty obvious he's pretty stressed out, but doing a really good job. And he was like trying to show Burlington like what happens when you defund the police, right? Like there's this public outcry because people are being assaulted for no reason, because some police lack basic human service skills that I developed in the fifth grade with my sense of humor, unfortunately. And kind of the public outcry was defund the police, fuck the police, and I'd see these like protests, this civic like unrest, like this disorderly whatever's in Burlington, and I was like, man, like you guys are kind of out of line. Like I get it, you're angry, you're into the movement or whatever, and I appreciate the support, but I do this for a living. I own a consulting firm. I have one of the best resumes in the country for criminal justice reform. Alternatives to incarceration is kind of my thing, and working with local law enforcement or patrol division is a big part of that. And I'd get upset at the lack of systemic change. But what Chief Murad showed us was what happens when you defund the police. You have, tagging on historic buildings. You have, no nighttime patrol division, which is similar like what happens in smaller towns with things like DUIs and stuff like that, where it's difficult to even get someone home from the bar safely when they drink too much. So when you defund the police, if people even know how to do that, that's what you have to worry about. And when you look at kind of okay, so why was the valedictorian of our class, public clinical psychologist, our valedictorian of the state college system, intern in Lamoille County who worked with John Brooklyn and worked in recovery housing and adult mental health, why is this guy, that coaches on the weekends, why is this guy who's the majority of his life is public service after he came into the federal criminal justice system 6 years ago, why is this guy making threats of somebody? Why is this guy at the state house with a gun? And you look at it and say, well, actually, constitutionally, the Second Amendment is how we defund the police. The Second Amendment is how we enact social change, because my strong legal argument is it all comes down to data. And Chief Del Pozo and Attorney George and a lot of other hardworking people and I used to meet at the Burlington Electric Department every 3 or so months and talk about how to work together in a coordinated effort to make Chittenden County a better place at Comstat and with the Chittenden County Opioid Alliance. And kind of like what I'm getting at is we would talk about statistics and data. And last weekend and Friday, I filed civil subpoenas for access to unedited body cam footage from a police department. I filed civil subpoena for access to public health records pertaining to a protective custody mental health evaluation hold that was, sought for me in kind of the seizure of me during a peaceful protest as a political prisoner. I sought a civil subpoena for access to court records out of a county that hasn't been communicating with me as a quote-unquote defendant. Those are civil subpoenas that I, filed with the court clerk in a local county in Vermont to see if they would release that type of information to the owner of a limited liability company social justice firm with an accredited degree in some of the better clinical training for criminal justice reform in the country. And I also, after reviewing some of the data from last year, filed some data requests with our Attorney General's office, who very nicely kind of delegated different organizations to get the data from. So I filed, public information's requests with Department of Corrections, with our Treasurer's office, and with another committee that kind of helps set the budget, and then the treasurer helps allocate it. And then ultimately that treasurer's job is to work with the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker of the House's job, like Nancy Pelosi, is the power of the purse. So what they do is distribute or allocate money from the treasurer set by this department, whatever it is. And then they work with Governor Scott to produce the budget, and Governor Scott produces the budget much like Nancy Pelosi with things like SAMHSA, only instead of SAMHSA working with their little committee in the House that then presents the budget as Nancy Pelosi's budget in Vermont, ADAP works with Human Services Commissioner or whatever, and Governor Scott who presents the budget under the executive branch. So what I'm getting at is all the data when it's allocated that I'm looking for in terms of like social justice is great, but you have to view the other side of the street to get stuff done. You can't just eliminate the Republican Party. You can't just eliminate the filibuster if you're a Sanders supporter in the grassroots politics and social justice. What you have to do is present your argument in a way that the Republican Party or people that are more conservative with government expenditure or anything else respects it. So like supporting Blue Lives Matter, saying things like semi-automatic sporting rifle instead of saying ban assault weapons. Like this is the language that you have to speak if you're trying to enact social justice, to work with two parties instead of completely eliminate the other one. Because with a lot of divisive arguments, there's normally two sides of the argument just to balance stuff out, because that's the way our forefathers designed their democracy. But in order to kind of speak to the broader audience, you need to present statistics. And all that money, when you look at the conservative argument for a lot of social justice stuff, is allocated through that position in the House, the Speaker of the House. So if you wonder why I was in Montpelier with a gun and why I was protesting something having to do with the Speaker of the House ethical duties in Vermont state constitutional standards, it's because that position is ultimately responsible for all that data that I'd been requesting, from everything from the residential counselor and the program coordinator, up to the ADAP, commissioner, whatever, to Vermont DOC, which I kind of left alone, to different people at Hub and Spoke, all these different people that I've been working with to try to get data and stuff like that. Ultimately, all that data, the funding and everything else, comes through not just ADAP, but is allocated through that position in the House. And if you look at why I might have brought a legal gun or wrote a decree or done the Montpelier Tea Party or anything else, defund the police is how the Patriots, the Boston Patriots, how, American patriots receded, from colonial British rule. It is. Defunding the British Parliament. That's the OG stuff of defund the police. When they're unhappy with the regulated government court systems in colonial America, they defunded, the British Parliament, by rejecting stamps, by doing the Boston Tea Party, by enacting social justice through protest until there was martial law declared in the Massachusetts colony, and then the Boston Massacre started, the revolution. So that's like the forefathers enacting social justice, like defund the police. But you need statistics to have a sound argument to get, the vast majority of people to say, hey, listen, this is the right thing to do, with petitions, with other professionals in the field referencing your work and stuff like that. In order to have access to that information beyond the Freedom of Information Act or beyond what the state or federal government puts out kind of in like findings reports, like I referenced over the weekend with opiate use disorder, you have to have access to information. The data is what people care about in human services. It's how you get stuff done. So like if you look at like any type of grant from SAMHSA, from ADAP or anything else, you have to have evidence-based results. You have to present your argument when it comes to some type of grant funding to the grant committee, and then you have to check in to let them know statistically how it's working. That's how grant funding works in the state of Vermont. That's how you get funding, from government entities. That's basically removing property from an inhabitant or a citizen, depending on what that person's role is as a taxpayer. But when you look at your abilities to defund the police, when you look at your abilities to basically have access to information beyond the Freedom of Information Act, if you don't have clearance, if you don't work for state or federal government, it should be all based in militia service. Because if I will defend and uphold the Constitution when structured government is crumbling with a safely owned firearm, what more speaks to being able to access things like tax allocation? And taxation without representation is is a point where tyranny starts. So if I don't know how I'm being taxed, taxation without representation, I should know how I'm taxed. That's how tyranny starts. So constitutionally, the argument for access to information comes from safe firearm ownership, and it comes from the ability to withhold taxes like defund the police, or to know where those taxes are going. So that's why I did my protest, amongst many, many other things, is basically access to public information. And ultimately, that money is allocated through the Speaker of the House, and that person will need to allocate or redistribute funding through like a public immediate expansion package like I presented, as well as ultimately kind of get the House to sponsor a bill, in H something in human services, to allow revisions to the public inebriate statute, and then have it signed into law by the Senate. So, there's a reason I did things the way they did, and a lot of it had to do with data.